Well, maybe.
Look, I will say I'm a little uncomfortable kind of kicking this off. I am from Sydney, Australia, and I'm a guest here at the New Zealand Young Writers Festival. So I'm not aware of the appropriate way to do acknowledgement to country right now. Is there anyone who would like to kind of make that happen right now? I think that's really important.
I can do it.
Yes, please.
Yeah, sure. So, kia ora everybody. Ko Inga Ahau, and welcome to this event at the New Zealand Young Writers Festival. My name is Ainge, I'm on the Fringe Trust, and I'm just here to hang out for the day. It's really great to have you here. I'm really pleased to see you, and thank you very much for having us come on this week. Kia ora koutou.
So I guess I'll kick off with introductions. So my name is Shirley. I'm a Vietnamese Australian writer from Sydney, Australia, and I'm part of the Sweatshop Writers Collective. Ellie?
Hi, I'm Eleanor. I'm Australian too, but I live in Dunedin, and I'm the New Zealand correspondent for The Guardian.
Great, and I'm Sasha Borissenko. Oh, that's quite loud, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, good morning. I'm a journalist. I'm currently working at Newsroom. I've got a background in law, and I'm a permanent resident of 28 years.
Yeah, so I was reminded to remind you of some housekeeping stuff. So bathrooms are here. Apparently there's not a lock on there, so make of that what you will. And there's an exit at the back, so that's the housekeeping done for today. I'll kick the panel off with our first question. So I'd like to ask Sasha and Ellie, how do you see yourselves situated in the hashtag #MeToo movement?
Okay, do you want to take that, Sasha?
Yeah, I mean, I've been reporting on it for many years, which is quite interesting in itself because it seems like in the past 2 years since Weinstein, there's suddenly an appetite for it. I started my career as a court reporter, and would just see the inequality that's before the courts when it comes to sexual assault survivors and how they're re-victimised time and time again, and just looking at that adversarial system. But it's only recently that, it's really resonating with audiences. But I think it's really informed all of my writing for the past, 7 years now.
I think that's interesting, Sasha, what you said about there still being an appetite for stories. So readership kept going up and up and up on the Russell McVeigh story.
Yeah, so I worked on that. And I mean, it's been massive. I can give you run off some stats. Like, for example, once that story broke, you had Zoe Norton who created a blog where there were 214 posts, and it was just up for a month, and then there was like a floodgate of defamation threats because of that website. Interestingly, throughout the whole process, I found this, and similarly, I think it's very evident by looking at what's seen in the media since this specific story, is that very few people are coming forward, and that's quite a strange phenomenon, I think. Some other stats, you had the Law Society releasing these stats where they canvassed 13,500 lawyers, and a third of them said they had been sexually assaulted in that lifetime, but meanwhile only 12% of people had made complaints. 30% of lawyers said that they needed a huge change in terms of workplace culture. Then you've got the Bar Association making these reports, you've got the Women's Law Association, and then you've got how, the gender split in terms of women representation in the Supreme Court and Court of Appeal, which is only 30%, and then take out Crown Law and you've only got 15% of that. So, I think when this story dropped, it kind of was a watershed moment, and it just kind of, I think all these issues like exploitation, workplace bullying, just suddenly was pushed to the fore.
Look, I'll be honest, I think as a woman of colour, I feel situated outside of the hashtag #MeToo movement. I think in the past 1 or 2 years, when I've seen these stories come out, they've felt so far, the experiences and the abuse of power don't feel that far to me, but just the representation of the women whose stories are being heard are alien to me. So I guess I can only speak from an Australian media perspective. I can see that a lot of the stories focus on, these white women in Hollywood. And so as a woman of colour in the workplace, I don't think that's particularly empowering to me, because I know as a woman of colour, if I do come forward with allegations, or if I do see another woman of colour telling her story, she's putting a lot at risk, because first of all, she's coming up against the barrier of not even being believed, you know? And so that's why I feel like perhaps the hashtag #MeToo movement is speaking to a certain population of women in the world, even though I am aware that hashtag #MeToo was started by a woman of colour, but I feel like that hashtag has been co-opted by elite Hollywood.
Yes.
So I guess this brings me to one of the next topics that we wanted to talk about today, and that was intersectional feminism. Did either of you have any kind of opinions on that, or what type of feminism do you relate to? Because there are so many, I guess, streams of different feminism today.
Okay, and maybe we should explain what intersectional feminism is. Does everyone? Would you want to?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah,
So I'm going to start off with talking about what the term white feminism means. I think that now that people are talking more about intersectional feminism, there's been some sort of backlash against, like, oh, but what do you mean? What do you mean when you're saying that intersectional feminism is a better way of understanding the experiences of women all around the world, rather than like white feminism? What does white feminism even mean? So I'd just like to refer to a tweet published 1 or 2 days ago by an Australian writer named Maxine Beneva Clark, and she says that white feminism doesn't mean every feminist who is white. She says that white feminism refers to a particular kind of feminism which denies intersectionality and upholds oppressive structures and benefits certain women over others. And so what intersectional feminism is trying to do is trying to understand that different women of different backgrounds and identities go through different struggles. And for a feminism that doesn't leave women behind, I personally relate a lot more to, I guess, intersectional feminism as a woman of colour. So, do we have anything to add?
I think, for us too, I think The Guardian takes a very sort of proactive approach to how we get on board with feminism. So our editor-in-chief is a woman, my boss is a woman, and what we really try to do in the simplest way, rather than having endless comment pieces, endless opinion pieces, which can get a bit tiring sometimes, we just make sure that our news coverage is very diverse and representative of the wider community. So on our homepage, we'll always look and we'll say, are there too many white men here? And that is something we literally do ask. We'll get an email from London, they'll go, too many white men, too many politicians on the page, shake it up a bit. And then, so we'll make sure that we have women of colour, that we have women, or people with disabilities, make sure it's diverse, because in that way, it becomes normalised. So that's how we handle it.
I think it's quite an interesting issue in terms of what you're writing about. I mean, as you were saying, that you can't necessarily relate, or it doesn't resonate with you with the Me Too movement. I think going back to the Russell McVeigh thing, because that's my kind of obsession at the moment, I think why it was so powerful at the time, it was a bunch of lawyers who are, the upper echelons of society, and no one really cares about anyone else, or that's kind of the rhetoric that's given from that. I think another interesting issue is writing about people or for people, trying to be as diverse as possible, but also I'm, a white woman, and there are certain privileges that is associated with that. And should I be writing things about people of colour, where actually I think that a person of colour should be writing that or have that opportunity, so.
I guess, sorry to interject, I should say a little bit about what Sweatshop does, for those of you who don't know. So we are a writers collective from specifically Western Sydney. So Western Sydney is probably one of the most culturally and linguistically diverse collection of communities in the whole of Australia. So hundreds of people from hundreds of nationalities and speak hundreds of languages other than English live in Western Sydney. But at the same time, Western Sydney has, been neglected for so long in terms of having appropriate infrastructure to, uplift these communities and put them near jobs and things like that. So what you have is an area of Sydney that is quite socio and economically disadvantaged. And what Sweatshop does is we try to provide these communities with an avenue of empowerment through creative writing. And you might be thinking, really, creative writing, when the problems that people in Western Sydney face seem a lot more practical than that. But to me, as someone who's grown up in Western Sydney, creative writing and thinking about the world around me in a critical way allowed me to empower myself in the workplace as well. So what I find is that, yes, I do work with a lot of white men, white people, but I find that I'm able to, stand up for myself and speak back when something is happening that I don't feel comfortable about. And I think through being able to write about those experiences and coming down to the very truth of what my existence as a Vietnamese Australian woman means in a country like Australia, it's shown me, a new way of articulating myself and understanding where I'm situated in the world around me. I'm going to do a shameless plug here, because why not? So I've got 2 books here. I've got The Big Black Thing Chapter 1 and Chapter 2. Both of these are for sale, and our manager, Winnie Dunn, she's sitting at the back right now. She will be at the Zine Fest later, as in maybe an hour or 30 minutes later, to be selling these books. So basically, these books are a collection of short stories from people of Indigenous and culturally and linguistically diverse communities in Western Sydney. And I guess when you pick up and you read this book, I think it'll be an interesting experience in terms of understanding what a true commitment to cultural diversity looks like.
I think, that's really interesting, because in terms of saying how powerful writing from the first person perspective can be, what we usually do now, it's become just the formula, is if we have a story, for the Kiwis here, Miriama Davidson, the co-leader of the Greens Party, when she opened up and disclosed the sexual assault that had happened to her, that was a big story here, and we covered it in a typical news fashion, but then we went to Miriama and said, would you also like to write for us, in your own words, completely unedited? And that's a really great opportunity for someone to take control of their own story, and I think at that point in her opening up, she was feeling quite overwhelmed about all the attention, and basically journalists like myself, white middle-class journalists, we control the story when we write about it, but she can take back control by writing about herself. And that's become something we do all the time now. We always offer that, especially to women and especially to women of colour. And usually it's taken up, and then it's incredibly well read too. So it shows that's one thing that we do anyway.
I mean, it's a hard thing because, of course, you've got, the state of journalism, you're essentially profiting off of someone's trauma, and there has to be a face, but, there's 2 different camps, public interest, off of the back of this trauma that's happened, and it could make change. Yeah, I think it's a really difficult thing to navigate.
Yeah, I think I feel I like your point about how stories of trauma have to have like a face to
Yes, yeah.
I think when stories of trauma by women of colour are put out there to the world, oftentimes we're seen as not the ideal face that people want to kind of look at when they hear stories of trauma. And I'll refer to one particular story, a news story in Sydney. There was a young woman of Asian background, I think she's Chinese, Vietnamese. Her name is Quinny Dick, and she was murdered one morning walking to school. And there was virtually no news coverage of her death, and the investigation into her death wasn't well covered either in news. And they spoke to the detective who worked relentlessly on her case for, I think, 2 or more decades, and he said that simply she was just not the ideal face for that case, and so Australian media completely ignored her story.
But it has to be palatable, right? Or this idea of what is palatable to an audience, you know, when you think of rape, or, you know, if it bleeds, it reads type thing, you know, it has to be a stranger in the middle of the night and, you know, a poor, vulnerable woman who's, you know, buttoned up, you know, and of a certain colour and wealth. But I think that's just, that comes down to a representation thing. So if we saw more diverse, you know, if there was better representation, I think that would change that construct. But I don't know, maybe I'm naive.
And with the, I mean, we're just going back a little bit, you were saying with the Me Too movement you didn't feel like it had much relevance to you.
Yeah.
But did you, as it has progressed and as it has changed and, you know, morphed, do you see any space for it to include people like yourself? Or
yes, I do see space for it to include people like myself, but I wouldn't count on mainstream Australian media doing that for me. So, which is why I turn to collectives like Sweatshop to find that safe space. We do also have a diverse women's collective run by our manager Winnie Dunn, and I've been a part of that collective, and it's absolutely been an amazing safe space for women of colour to come together and to speak freely about our experiences. Oftentimes, when we're speaking honestly about what it's like to be a woman of colour, we do encounter, I guess, white people taking it personally that we're sledging them. That's not really the case. What we're talking about is we're talking about the oppressive structures that are holding us back, and it just so happens that the current structures privilege white-skinned people. So it's inevitable that that gets drawn into the discussion.
On that note, I read a really good anecdote. It was actually The Guardian. It was like talking about white women's tears.
that was excellent.
And
that was really good.
And it was, I read it and I thought, oh my God, have I done this? You know?
So that's by Australian writer Ruby Hamad, and in that article she starts the story off talking about a panel that Sweatshop did in Western Sydney. So that panel got super fiery, super spicy. And essentially there were, I think, 4 or 5 writers of colour, including myself, on the stage, speaking about what it means to be a writer of colour, and a white woman in the audience decided to attack us during question time. So, you know, that's a very confronting experience, but to be honest with you, that is almost an everyday experience as a person of colour. And so we find that we can feel very silenced every day when we feel like it's not safe to speak openly about it, because You know, you might get attacked, you might get called out in public, that kind of thing. But yeah, look, it was a very controversial article as well. It cost one woman, African American journalist in America, her job for sharing it. For sharing it or for even liking it on social media. It cost her job. And so for me as a writer of colour with a day job, you know, that hits home for me too. Like, will I lose my job for kind of being open about my political views? But sorry, I guess on the topic of day jobs, how is the conversation about pay equity unfolding in New Zealand? I guess I'm coming from Australia, so I'm not well versed in this. Do we have what is that conversation like here?
I think it's pretty robust at the moment, and I'd say it's we've got a very powerful, everyone knows, Minister for Women and Julianne Genter. She's very passionate, and also our female Prime Minister. It's something that's close to her heart. So it's still slow, and it will still take time, but certainly it's valued by our politicians rather than being sidelined. I mean, our last Prime Minister, Bill English, famously said he didn't know what feminism was. So I think we've come a little bit further from that. So it's sort of in a safe space now where this is something that can be championed and pushed. What do you think, Sasha?
I mean, I'd agree with that. You know, obviously you've made great strides in terms of, you know, all these, well, recently even last couple of weeks or whatnot with the nurses unions and the pay equity kind of being at the fore. However, I don't know, I think you've got people like, I mean, I'm talking in my personal capacity, 100% here. I think we've got media platforms where you've got the likes of Mike Hosking, Duncan Garner, Mark Richardson, who they have a huge audience, and they could be changing or at least have a neutral opinion. But I think it's really damaging what they have to say.
And they're so loud. Incredibly loud.
They're so loud.
They dominate the conversation, and they say the most outrageous things that then they sort of have to get picked up as news stories because they're so outrageous.
And what's crazy about it is that for some reason there's this rhetoric around them being the voice of reason or the voice of public opinion. You know, like, oh, we represent all the key, you know.
We're the good Kiwi blokes, and it's sort of the barometer of moral issues.
Where I just think, well, hang on, you don't represent, you know, New Zealand at all. You know.
This is just, I was wondering, do you think there's any females in the media space who are as loud as they are, or as prominent or get as much coverage in New Zealand?
Oh, I just don't think they get heard.
Christine Rankin gets heard quite a bit. She's pulled up all the time as a social advisor or whatever on almost every panel.
Yes, however though, I mean, you know, the first thing you see in the media about her is what she's wearing.
Yeah.
You know, so I don't think it's the same for women and men at all.
And I'm just thinking about prominence too. Something Duncan Garner says or something Mike Hosking says will be put on as the lead news story on the webpage, so you can just see where we're placing our value and whose voices get the platform. I can't think of a single female journalist or commentator who has, in New Zealand, who has the same prominence as either of those men.
No.
And Mark Richardson, or someone like Mark Richardson, he's up there too with his.
Yeah, I mean, the thing, you know, when I think shock jock comes to mind in a, you know, the female equivalent, what was that one, now she's left journalism, she's on News Talk ZB, and she said something about heifers.
Kate, is she the one that's married to Mike Hosking?
No, it was a different one. It was quite, anyway, I'll Google it later on. But yeah, no, I think that even though so-called it's been 125 years since women's suffrage, I don't think we're even remotely there when you've got this kind of damaging stuff happening.
Goodness, so that's pretty disheartening to hear. I was thinking that it'd be a little bit more optimistic here than in Australia, because I was going to say that in Australia I don't think the situation is that much better. In terms of pay equity, I don't think that's a discussion that we're hearing in mainstream Australian media. Instead, we're hearing more discussion about pay equality, which means that the most prominent stories about women's pay are inevitably elite elite white women. So I would say the women who are at a CEO level. So it's always, the discussion I'm finding is always about whether female CEOs are getting paid as much as male CEOs. And I think that's quite alienating for the rest of the population because speaking as a woman of colour, only 12% of culturally and linguistically diverse women surveyed strongly agreed that they have even the same opportunities in their workplace as someone who is who has the same ability and experience. And 26% of those women said that cultural barriers in the workplace have actually caused them to scale back on their ambitions and to reduce their hours. So I think the conversation in Australia really, kind of sweeps away at real experiences that the rest of the women there are experiencing. And especially for marginalised women, those marginalised groups in the workplace would be Asian and Muslim and Indigenous women, just to name a few of those marginalised communities. And so the experiences we're facing are not really mirrored in the media around us, which is a shame. So yeah, I think in Australia there's a long way to go before we reach that conversation about pay equity at all.
I think just to build on what you were saying, I think obviously there's a kind of a fundamental flaw here in the system, which is the fourth estate. But what we haven't really talked about is just the fact that it's crumbling across the board. You know, like if I look back when I was at a mainstream news outlet, you'd be required to pump out 3 stories a day, and you'd be so exhausted, and you'd invest no, energy into it, getting paid essentially 20 cents an hour, and it's going straight to web. I think there's definitely, we don't put enough resources into the power of journalism. We're really needing to rethink that.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Can I just point out that Christine Bartlett case, it did get quite a bit of, and it is about pay equity, and it did get a lot of coverage.
Yes.
That was a win. That was a fantastic moment.
I don't ignore it altogether,
Oh, no, not at all.
Progress in this country.
Oh, very much so.
And there's been a lot of progress. I was a part of the feminist movement in the 70s.
Right.
And you don't even want to think about what it was like for a lot of us then.
Right. No, of course. I mean, I've been really interested in terms of the abortion side of things, and I followed a lot of Margaret Sparrow's work and reading her books about women's struggles throughout that time and looking at the feminist movements. I completely agree with you, and I don't mean to belittle what we've got currently, but I think there's still a lot that can be done.
Oh, of course.
I was just wanting to ask you, so if you've got a large platform like a newsroom or The Guardian or something like that, what more could these outlets be doing to help incorporate voices of colour, cover it better, these stories?
Well, I can only say that across the news outlets that I would look at is, I don't know, I think that's a question for the women of colour in your organisations to kind of come together and discuss that with you. I don't operate in the news business, so I can't kind of go in and be like, you need to fix this. Just as a reader, I still do not see enough of those women of colour, like people of colour voices. I mean, I think I should give credit in Australia to NITV. I think NITV is a wonderful platform, and I believe that it is run predominantly by Indigenous Australian journalists, and so we need kind of organisations like that where there's space for people of colour to really take control of their own stories without the interference of a white gaze. But yeah, I mean, how are we going for time? Would we like to open it up to the audience for some questions? Does anyone have any questions for us to discuss or talk about? What haven't we covered? What have we covered?
What does Me Too mean to you guys? How have you guys watched it evolve from where it originally started to where it is now? We were just talking before, and I thought it was pretty extraordinary. About a month ago, the Pop-Up Globe launched their Me Too season, but for 2 of the plays failed to include any women at all. So that for me was sort of a really classic moment of how, of it being utilised for marketing purposes, basically.
Totally, or it's social capital, like how many things do you see on my Facebook page where all these kind of brocialists, saying, me too, happened to me too. Sit down, mate. This is not your platform,
I just want to make a quick comment. Because we didn't see much in the media in the 70s, we came out with our own magazine called Broadsheet.
Yes.
And most of us are not journalists and could not, even claim to be good writers, but we put together a magazine and we managed to all take turns putting in articles of things that were relevant to us, and I think the magazine ran for quite a while and did not too badly, everything considered.
Yeah. Oh, I'm a big fan of Broadsheet.
Oh.
Recently I've been looking into obesity and looking at, shock horror, the obesity crisis, in quotation marks, and talking to people, they say that where we're at currently is the result of patriarchy, colonialism, and there's another one, capitalism. And then of course I was going through the Auckland Museum because they've got this really amazing exhibition to celebrate suffrage, and it had all broadsheet examples from the 70s, and one of which was completely on my topic that I'm currently looking at, where there's no airtime currently, and right there, clear as day, written, looking at weight stigma. It was awesome.
Do you think we have the equivalent broadsheet now at all, with the villainess or something like that? Or I don't know.
No, I don't think so.
Maybe we need that.
I think we definitely do.
Another broadsheet 2.0.
I mean, what has happened with the feminist movement now? I mean, what do you think?
Me?
Yeah.
Look, I do think that there's a rise in awareness about intersectional feminism. So for me, that's a positive. So I would say that growing up, I didn't really have a kind of mode or stream of feminism that I could specifically relate to. And for a while, I definitely thought that I could relate to someone like Sheryl Sandberg with her book Lean In. And so reading Bell Hooks, who is a cultural theorist, she kind of redefined the boundaries of feminism for me. I think her book Feminism is for Everybody really changed me. She defines feminism as simply the need to destroy sexism. And so sexism, she says, affects both men and women in our societies. It's not just toxic to women. And that really, it really changed my parameters of thinking. No longer was I guess, aspiring to be a female CEO, or thinking that I could even really get there. And I think that form of power feminism ignores the oppressive structures that we're kind of living under. And so, that's what feminism means to me now, is trying to find voices that I can connect with on a personal level, and trying to understand as much as possible what women of different parts of the world are going through, and realising my own privileges as well.
I guess for me, 2 aspects. So in our work life, or my work life, that would mean always pitching stories that have a really strong sort of feminist message. So recently, the passing of the domestic violence bill through the House, we did that 700 words, and that means that men and women are now entitled to paid leave if they're having an experience of domestic violence. So I'll always push those stories, and our editors will push those stories. And then I guess in my personal life, this year particularly, I think I've just got sick of taking shit. So I've just kind of reached and a lot of my friends have too. I don't know if it's the same with your friends, but a lot of us have, and I think the Me Too movement can be applauded for that, is it does give a name to something that we can then talk about. And so in my personal life, if somebody is doing something really inappropriate at a bar or standing in my space, I'll just say, this is really inappropriate, back off, I'm uncomfortable. And I do that all the time now because I'm so sick of, year after year after year having to deal with that. And I think that's, I don't know, with your friends, has it reached a kind of point of such frustration that you just go, no, I can't really take this?
I think I'm in the, I'm post the angry phase. I'm in the defeated phase. I'm just tired, I'm exhausted. I'm just like, why are we even having this conversation, and why am I even arguing with, Twitter troll or keyboard warrior over whether there's a pay equity issue? Like, facts speak for themselves, mate. I don't know. I'm just exhausted.
I'd like to say that my journey with feminism has only just begun a few years ago with kind of finding more about intersectional feminism. So I think I'm still feeling optimistic about the journey ahead. And I think for marginalised women, it's a matter of life and death, or like it's not something that we can really turn away from. So for me, I will simply still keep on writing and still keep on sticking to this purpose in my work, and I don't plan on stopping anytime soon, because for me the cause that I'm working towards, it feels very urgent to me, and to speak to the women in my community, there's no way that I can turn away from that. There are, I guess, some women who I've encountered who are like, they will call themselves intersectional feminists because that's the word of the day, I think, lately. But to me, the women in my family for the past couple of generations, my mum and aunts, they worked like 15-hour days slaving away in sweatshops in Western Sydney to make garments that Australians would purchase for, $80 to $100. And the cut that my mum and my auntie would take away from that would be, a maximum of like 10% of that cut. And so, when you see the injustice and affect your people in that way, it's not an option to really turn away from it as a writer in that community.
Maybe we could turn that to the audience. Who's feeling defeated, angry, or optimistic? Who's optimistic? Anyone who's feeling optimistic? Do you guys want to tell us why?
I was going to put my hand up for all of them.
Okay, fair enough.
Because it depends on the moment of the day.
Yes.
Really.
Well, being positive, what's something that makes you feel optimistic about the climate at the moment?
Well, I don't know. I was going to put my hand up for angry and optimistic.
Yeah, me too, both of them.
Yeah, it's like, it's related. It's I am angry about things, and I therefore kind of feel that we can and should change them.
Well, it gives you a sense of drive and purpose, right?
Yeah.
There's nothing, what is it? Hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. Very true. What's
That
my
yes.
I want to be angry, and I think largely because of social conditioning, I'm like,
I
have like a stop on that. I'm like, I have to be so reasonable about this, and like engage in a soft way because of and I can feel myself doing it. I get so mad at myself, like the anger turns back on myself. It's so dumb.
Because you can't be hysterical, right?
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
So that's really interesting. I haven't heard that perspective before. So you're monitoring your own reactions.
I just know that I'm doing it in every aspect of my life, and I've become way more aware of how that is like part of me being a woman. Like it's not just It's not just me and my mental illness or whatever. It's like hugely how I've been.
But you're told from day one that you've got to be nice and sweet and
Yeah,
cool girl. So of course you know, I don't know. I find that myself all the time. Like I'll be the lawyer, and then 2 seconds later I'll feel sad, and I'll be like, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry about that. Why am I saying sorry? I'm just standing up for myself.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I always find that if I'm told to work in a group, I can either step back and be walked over, or if I try and take charge, that makes me the bossy one.
Yes.
It's
Right. Well,
you can be walked over,
Yeah.
or you can be bossy. There is no.
yes. Well,
That's
to
a
quote
fair
Nicki
point.
Minaj,
For a woman.
she says it. If you're a dude, you're a boss. If you're a chick, you're a bitch.
Yeah.
Anyone feeling totally? Oh, do you want, yeah, Greta, do you want to?
Yeah, I just had a question. I guess, Shirley, you as a writer, and then both of you as journalists. I work as a journalist too, sort of, Ellie. And I guess my interest comes from the fact that the media that I work in is predominantly white, predominantly male, but we do have a decent number of female writers. But I guess my question to you, particularly Shirley, is is it enough for people like me who are white but try to understand, say, if you're coming from a particular, I don't know, whether it's related to race or whether it's just something separate, say, going on Marae and doing a story there. Is it enough for me to try to understand and interpret what you're telling me? Or do we just need to get better and just actually diversify our newsrooms?
The second option. So,
Yeah.
every time a white person tries to talk on a person of colour's behalf, it's essentially, the person of colour has essentially been robbed of a chance to speak for themselves, but also a chance to be employed in a industry that is already so white. It's. I know that's an uncomfortable thing to hear, but I think change can happen, and I think it is happening quite slowly. I do know that in Australia there can be, cadetship programs specifically for young Indigenous journalists, and I think that's really important. But I think something to consider as well is that when you're a person of colour who is feeling marginalised in the workplace as well, it can be really difficult to affect change at all. And so I think the diversification needs to happen urgently, and it needs to happen at a greater rate than just a token Indigenous person or a token Asian person in the workplace. So those are my thoughts on that.
That's a huge problem in New Zealand too, isn't it? We don't even have Maori cadetships or anything like that.
No, nothing.
Pacific cadetships is, because I'm Australian too, so at least I know the ABC,
SBS as
yeah,
well.
they have really good
Does
programs.
it a couple?
Who does?
I think Radio New Zealand has got a couple of.
Oh,
They do, but currently they've only got one Māori journalist.
yeah, it's pretty, and that's a national broadcaster. It's like regular,
So that's problematic. In the legal context, I worked at a law firm in a couple years ago or whatever, and it was so interesting. They just could not understand the concept of tokenism. And it was hilarious because, of course, on all of their grad campaigns, I would hear the conversations and they'd say, we think we might be having a trans person. Yes. I was like, this is ridiculous. And then furthermore, you've got no representation, but if you do, they're in an environment where they're completely ostracised.
Yeah.
So how are they going to flourish? I don't know.
Exactly. I think there's a fine line between wanting to be race blind and seeing race, and I think the way that race politics and the conversations around that are progressing, I think slowly we're moving towards a dialogue that is more comfortable for people of colour. And so I am optimistic when I see that, and I think for this particular panel no one's tried to attack me yet. So
Civilised in Dunedin.
yeah.
The local newspaper, which is produced a couple of hundred metres down the road, every Saturday has an obituary page. And today, I'm not quite, I can't remember, I think there were 5 men. Last week, there were 4 men. The week before that, there would have been 7 men, including international dictators. Women on that page, right here, have, whether, it doesn't matter what colour you are, have no profile at all.
Really?
Yes.
This is ODT?
Yeah.
Yes.
Have you got in touch with the ODT about that?
I have written to the paper and they said there are no suitable stories.
Goodness.
Oh.
When they find one, they will include it.
Can I point out that that is owned and has been by a family for a long, long time, and it's male-owned and it shows. But and I will point out Murdoch owns a lot of the papers in the world, including papers here that we see. And while they're owned by males who are extremely conservative, white conservative males, then that's the side we're going to see.
Oh, totally.
Very well, you know. I just don't see how we can get them to change.
Well, I
Unless
feel.
we start maybe possibly owning.
Well, no, I think, like, you know, the place I work for is a wonderful illustration of what's coming through the cracks. You know, independent, good, hard news, got representation. Essentially, they let me run loose, which I do have issues with authority. And you know, I really struggle with the fact that you've got all these media outlets professing and talking about exploitation, talking about gender representation, talking about all of these progressive things, where, you know, in their backyard, you've got all these travesties happening in the industry. And I can't, the hypocrisy really gets to me. But it does not happen at all at my workplace, and my workplace is absolutely wonderful.
Yeah, you might have to cut your subscription to the ODT. It does not sound like it's worth it.
Well, it is, you know, if you're buying it, you're adding to the clicks or
Yeah.
We do buy it and it does, at least we do have an overall coverage of what happens apart from women.
Sure.
Oh no,
Yeah.
cut it. Sign up to Newsroom or The Guardian.
We'll definitely keep in touch with them and keep talking to them, I think.
Or just read the Star.
I do read the Star.
Which is also owned by the ODT.
It is, female chief reporter for years.
Okay.
Yeah,
Do you
so
want to start? Do you want to say something?
I just quickly, just noticing that it's a largely white female audience. What do you think about that in terms of you have a platform to speak and you're all speaking really?
Can I just point out that I identify as Maori, even though you might think I'm white?
I'm not.
Okay.
I'm just
Okay.
talking about like
Thank you.
largely.
This room is mostly white.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, what do you like? Why aren't there more dudes
Oh.
here? As we're talking about feminism,
Yeah.
but is for
Well,
everyone.
because all the dudes were alienated, not all men, right?
Yeah.
But I mean, you know, I think you've got a very good point. Like, I'm educated, I've studied for 8 years, I'm a champagne shot socialist to a T, and I'm drinking kombucha. And yeah, but I call it, it's completely bullshit.
yeah, I mean, go on.
No, you go.
Yeah, look, it's not a surprise to me. It's kind of the same thing in Sydney that I see a lot of the time. I think the literature space and I guess writers' festivals has long been, at the helm of them have long been gatekeepers who have privileged certain voices over others. But we are seeing a slow change, and hopefully I think that will filter down into the type of audience numbers that we get, and the type of audience members that we get. I think engaging with diverse communities is a difficult conversation and a difficult space to navigate. And all I can say is that for festival organisations and such, is to actually engage with people from those communities to actively try and offer them space in places and panels like this. So yeah, but happy to be here.
Yeah.
I think also, 50% of the workforce, they're going to be millennials by 2020. I do have a little bit of hope
Yeah.
in the sense that, you know, if we're all boss bitches one day, damn, that spread is going to be tight, you know.
Yeah. No, I was just going to say, like, I agree with your point, and it's, again, it's something that happens repeatedly all the time in these sorts of situations, but I would think of it, like, looking around and thinking that, I'd see it as a challenge. How do we change it? How do we shake it up? How do we make this more appealing? Going to the communities, like you said, having this in a different space, maybe that's not quite so, I mean, this place has a long history of it being white and Otago and all those sorts of things. So I would see it more as like a brainstorming exercise.
Yes.
What can we change? What can we change that would be different from the setup now that may appeal to a wider demographic?
Yeah. I mean, I definitely feel more safe and comfortable speaking in Western Sydney than I do in the inner city of Sydney. So sometimes it is a matter of going out to those spaces and holding events there. But yeah, look, yep.
What do you mean by safe in Western Sydney and closer in?
What I mean by that is safe to freely talk about how I'm feeling, I guess, without being attacked. So at the beginning of this panel, we did talk about the article from Ruby Hamad, and at the beginning of that article, it referenced an incident that happened at one of Sweatshop's panels where we were attacked by a woman in the crowd who, so you know, that's a question of safety, you know, mental and emotional safety and physical safety at times as well. So it's tragic that writers of colour have to factor that into our everyday living and as our careers as writers. But you know, what can we do? We push on because we want to reach the marginalised communities that we're, you know, trying to speak to. And so at the end of the day, that purpose keeps me going.
I just want to point out that I never feel safe in Australia. It's inherently racist. People there make the most racist comments unashamedly, frequently, in bars and cabs and things. Why anybody, I can't even stand to go there on holidays because I have family there. Why anybody would choose to live there is quite beyond me.
Do you know everyone in Australia?
Not yet.
All right.
Well, I didn't have a choice to live in Australia. My parents were boat people after the Vietnam War, and whatever country accepted them onto their shores, they had to make do with that. So I didn't have a choice in that matter, but I can hear what you're saying.
Wait, can I say something?
Yeah.
I just want to say thank you. It's been a really amazing discussion. One of the things that I feel really strongly about is kind of what I refer to as silent abuse, and that's sort of silent domestic emotional abuse. And it's not something that we talk about.
No.
And I feel really, really strongly about it because I am someone who has experienced that.
Yeah.
And I'm really interested in all of your opinion about how we can make this something that we do talk about. And sometimes media is a really good way to start that conversation. So I'm really just interested in your views on that.
Well, for example, I'm really interested in how we all talk about child poverty, right? But my understanding of child poverty is the poverty of women, or you know, in situations such as abusive relationships. Well, our stats are hideous. It's like 1 in 3 women, or 1 in 5. I would have to double check that. Fake news, but no, I think people just don't. There's this idea that there isn't an appetite for it, but I am so interested in reporting on that.
Yeah.
And I've looked into protection orders, and the idea that does a piece of paper actually protect anyone? What is the breadth, or physical abuse is treated in terms of the courts as more severe than mental or emotional abuse, which I think is ridiculous. I mean, I've got I've experienced things, and I'm very, very passionate about that space, and I think that definitely has to be put on the agenda. So let's chat afterwards.
I was just going to say, I agree that sort of more media coverage or more in-depth and nuanced media coverage is helpful, but I also love it when we have a government who does practical, legislates for this. So with the domestic violence bill, you now are entitled to paid leave. That's recognising that this is a massive problem, overwhelmingly for women, and that the state will help you get out of it. You know, that will make society better as a whole, rather than it's not just a woman's problem at all, it's everyone. So I find things like that really encouraging, and I think then we give those huge coverage. And I think there should be more money in it. I mean, you know, quite away from the media, a lot more money needs to be invested, and I do think it needs to be dealt with as, it's still very much sort of sidelined as sort of an embarrassing thing that's not talked about too much, but I think it needs to be discussed more, but also the practicalities of money, a lot more money. You know, the women's refuges hadn't had haven't had any budget for 10 years, any rising budget. They did get one, they got 80 million this year, but they could do with 3-4 times that. We've got one of the highest rates of domestic violence in the world, and I don't think there's any recognition of how that impacts work, you know, relationships, children, child poverty, all those things. That intersectionality of it is not being recognised in New Zealand, and until it is, you know, we're not really dealing with it.
I'm quite interested to see the mechanics of how that pans out. Like, for example, if you're in an abusive relationship, what incentive do you have to come forward? You know, I don't think in reality, I'd be very surprised if it comes to anything, because I think that's the biggest, I don't know, people who I've talked to, you wouldn't know in a million years that this is happening, so they're sure as hell not going to tell their boss. So I don't know, I'm quite interested to see what happens in that space.
There needs to be a real major shift in attitude.
Yes, but it comes down to toxic masculinity. Like, how is it that, you know, our numbers in terms of domestic violence shoots up when there's a loss in terms of rugby? That is ridiculous. It's a sport. You know, I mean, there's a serious problem at play.
Yeah, look,
There is a serious problem.
I'd just like to say that those women are generally faceless. Like you said, there's perhaps, what was it, 1 in 5 or 3 in 5, whatever it was. I don't know any woman in my circle who have experienced that, and perhaps it's not that they aren't there, it's just that they haven't talked about it. So perhaps those women need a face in media, and perhaps they don't want to talk about it, but maybe they do, but maybe they're stories that people don't want to read, like you.
Well, I don't think that's necessarily true. I think there is an appetite for it. I mean, even so, I don't care, you know. But I don't know, again, it's that idea of, you know, someone who's been robbed of choice and they've been put in a situation that's traumatic. For them, the onus on them to have to tell their story, I don't know. I really don't like that.
It puts a lot of, it's just huge pressure.
And why is it
on one person or 2 people or whoever.
Yeah. I mean, they're a product of their community, you know, and how many bystanders have happened, you know, from their partner's family. You know, I just think, why is the responsibility always on the victim or the survivor in this context?
Yeah, look, I think from a literature perspective, I think literature can aim to make cultural change. And so as a writer who is part of a community where people are producing essays and stories and creative work, I think it would benefit to have a more complex representation of emotional capacity in our society from both men and women on our screens and movies and books and such. And so I think with that increased visibility as well, we can start to be more honest about emotions and how humans function with their emotional depth, rather than just aiming towards you have to be happy all the time, or at least it's acceptable to look or present as a happy person all the time in society. But yeah, any last questions?
I'm going to be the lone male voice.
Oh, please. Not all men.
But a couple of things. I have hope, because I'll go back to the 1981 tour, which was a watershed moment for New Zealand, because it was reported. We had a diversity, there were 2 equal sides saying it's just a game of rugby, there was one side. But it was an important point for New Zealand, because Maoridom stood up and said, great, you guys, and for me it was, they said, you're fighting for someone overseas, now let's talk about us. Let's talk about the racism that's in New Zealand. So I think it's very important, and I was part of university. I was part of the university students' governing body, and we had, for the first time ever, we had a woman president who decided, and I supported her. She said, we're going to edit the Capping magazine because it's sexist, it's racist, we've got policy. I was the publications manager, and she said, we're going to do this, how do you feel? And I went, right on, sister, I'll support you. And they crucified us. So it was the same thing. So it's very important that you get out there and continue to tell the stories, or we end up like Sarah Huckabee, who's standing up and facing up to that kind of thing. So it is a very, and you can't give up hope, because you don't know where it's going, what little story will suddenly trigger someone and it'll do the avalanche, like the Aotearoa tour.
Yeah, true. But they say, if you, the history, progress, and there's always backlash,
Yes.
in terms of periods. So I wonder, we're really pushing through, especially with this Me Too movement, and I think caregiving responsibilities among men and women in terms of relationships. But yeah, I just wonder if it's going to keep going, or will we be transported back into the 50s? I don't know.
It's a very important thing that you can't stop telling the stories.
Oh, yes, you're right. Capitalism.
Okay.
All right. I guess if there are no more questions, we'll wrap up there. But thank you. So it's a Sweatshop. The Sweatshop. So our manager's actually there. She's been watching the chicken.
I kind of ran out of space there, and then I was like, oh. Because I guess how you it was like the blank one there, but I hope that simple split up.